Sometimes the cruelest thing a crowd can do is laugh before destiny decides to answer. Evelyn Carter held the final silver thread between her fingers as dawn spilled across the tiny attic room she called home, the pale golden light revealing every careful stitch she had sewn by hand over the past 4 months. The dress resting across her lap was simple, far simpler than the elegant gowns worn by daughters of wealthy alpha families, yet every seam carried the quiet hope she had refused to surrender. She had mended old fabric collected from forgotten trunks, matched faded pieces until they looked almost new, and embroidered a delicate pattern of tiny moonflowers around the sleeves because her late mother used to whisper that the moon never forgot those who remained kind when the world rewarded pride. Evelyn smiled despite the knot in her chest, smoothing one last wrinkle before carefully lifting the dress against herself. It was not beautiful by royal standards, but for the first time in years, she felt seen by her own reflection. Her pale skin glowed softly in the morning light, her chestnut hair falling in loose waves around gentle blue eyes that still carried optimism no amount of ridicule had managed to erase. Downstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed 7 times, each echo reminding her that the Moon Festival had finally arrived. Every pack across the Northern Territories would gather at Blackwood Palace before sunset, celebrating unity beneath the full moon while the Alpha King observed every noble family in attendance. Rumors traveled faster than the autumn wind. Some claimed the king would announce new royal decrees. Others insisted he intended to choose the future Luna before the year ended. Evelyn expected neither miracle nor recognition. She simply wanted one evening without hearing someone call her worthless. She reached for the tiny silver necklace hanging beside the cracked mirror, pressing it gently against her lips before fastening it around her neck. It was the only gift her mother had left behind, and wearing it always made her feel less alone. The quiet moment shattered when the front door slammed downstairs. Sharp footsteps echoed through the house, followed by her stepmother's impatient voice calling her name with the familiar tone reserved for servants rather than daughters. Evelyn carefully folded the blanket covering the bed, slipped into the dress, and took one steady breath before opening the bedroom door. As she descended the narrow staircase, she could already hear her stepsister laughing with visiting friends about the grand celebration waiting beyond the village. Their polished shoes, jeweled hairpins, and expensive perfumes filled the hallway with effortless confidence. Evelyn lowered her eyes, hoping to pass unnoticed, but hope had rarely protected her inside this house. Her stepmother looked her over from head to toe, saying nothing for several long seconds before a thin smile appeared across her face. It was the kind of smile that always arrived just before another lesson about knowing her place. Evelyn instinctively tightened her fingers around the fabric she had worked so hard to create, unaware that before the moon reached its highest point, this humble dress would become the center of a moment the entire kingdom would remember for generations. The journey to Blackwood Palace took nearly 3 hours by carriage, winding through towering pine forests where banners bearing the royal silver wolf fluttered above every village they passed. Evelyn sat on the narrow rear bench beside stacked travel trunks, careful not to wrinkle the dress she had protected all morning. The cool autumn breeze slipped through the small window, carrying the scent of cedar, fresh earth, and distant fireplaces. She watched families lining the roads with hopeful faces, children waving at passing carriages, merchants setting up colorful stalls, and musicians tuning violins for the festival that only came once each year. Every mile brought them closer to the heart of the kingdom, where every noble pack would gather beneath one roof. Her stepsister, Victoria Carter, occupied the plush seat inside the carriage beside their stepmother, Margaret Carter, surrounded by expensive velvet cushions and polished luggage. They spent the trip discussing which influential families would attend and which unmarried alphas might become valuable allies. Evelyn remained invisible, except when another order drifted toward the back of the carriage. Bring the water, fix the shawl, hold the jewelry case. Each request arrived without thanks, as naturally as breathing. She answered every command with quiet grace, unwilling to spoil the day with arguments that would change nothing. When the palace finally appeared beyond the hills, even Evelyn forgot to breathe for a moment. Blackwood Palace rose from the cliffs like something carved from moonlight itself. Towering stone walls stretched across acres of land, crowned with silver banners dancing in the wind. Crystal windows reflected the afternoon sun so brightly that the entire fortress seemed wrapped in liquid gold. Hundreds of elegant carriages filled the enormous courtyard, while finely dressed guests stepped onto polished marble walkways leading toward the grand hall. Noble families greeted one another with practiced smiles, each hoping to impress the royal court. Servants hurried between fountains, carrying flowers, silver trays, and embroidered cloaks, preparing every detail for the evening celebration. Margaret adjusted Victoria's expensive sapphire necklace before stepping gracefully from the carriage. "Remember," she whispered, loud enough for Evelyn to hear, "today is about making the right people notice you." Victoria smiled with effortless confidence, accepting compliments before she had even crossed the courtyard. Then Margaret turned toward Evelyn. Her expression cooled instantly. "You will stay behind us at all times. Speak only if someone asks you a direct question. Carry Victoria's belongings. Keep your eyes lowered. And do not embarrass this family by pretending you belong among our guests." Evelyn nodded without protest. She had memorized those rules years ago. She lifted the small, embroidered bag containing Victoria's gloves and fan before following several steps behind them through the enormous palace entrance. Inside, the grand hall surpassed every story she had ever heard. Massive chandeliers shimmered above polished stone floors, while musicians filled the air with elegant melodies. Towering white columns framed balconies draped in silver silk, and moonflower arrangements perfumed the room with a delicate sweetness. Everywhere she looked, powerful alphas exchanged greetings, respected betas negotiated alliances, and graceful omegas laughed beneath sparkling crystal lights. Evelyn quietly slipped toward the edge of the hall beside one of the marble columns, exactly where no one would notice her. Yet, as she observed the endless sea of smiling faces, she could not shake the strange feeling that somewhere inside this magnificent palace, unseen eyes were already watching far more carefully than anyone realized. Soft music drifted through the grand hall as servers moved gracefully between clusters of noble guests carrying polished silver trays filled with sparkling cider, fresh fruit, and delicate pastries. Evelyn remained near the marble column, quietly observing the celebration while making certain Victoria's embroidered bag never slipped from her shoulder. She had always believed kindness could exist even in places ruled by pride, so when one elderly servant stumbled slightly beneath the weight of a heavy tray, she instinctively stepped forward to steady it before a single glass could fall. "Thank you, dear," the woman whispered with genuine gratitude before disappearing back into the crowd. Evelyn answered with a gentle smile and returned to her place before anyone noticed. Unfortunately, someone had noticed. Victoria turned just in time to see the exchange, her pleasant expression fading into irritation. She crossed the polished floor with two young noblewomen following close behind, each wearing jeweled gowns that shimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers. "There you are," Victoria said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I told you to stay where I could see you. Instead, you wander around pretending you belong with palace servants." Several guests glanced toward Evelyn before politely looking away. She lowered her eyes. "I was only helping someone carry a tray." Victoria laughed softly, and her friends joined her without hesitation. "Helping? That is the only thing you have ever been good for." Margaret approached moments later, having finished greeting another influential family. Her gaze immediately settled on Evelyn's simple handmade dress. "I warned you not to draw attention to yourself," she said coldly. "Stand behind your sister and remain silent." Evelyn quietly obeyed, but whispers had already begun to spread among the nearby guests. Some admired Victoria's elegant appearance. Others barely acknowledged the quiet Omega standing several feet behind her. A few curious eyes lingered on Evelyn's modest dress before quickly moving on. The orchestra changed melodies as more distinguished nobles entered the hall. Excitement filled the room with renewed energy. Victoria accepted compliments with practiced elegance, while Margaret introduced her to prominent alpha families. Evelyn simply followed, carrying gloves, folding shawls, and adjusting the train of Victoria's gown whenever it caught beneath polished shoes. Nearly an hour passed before Victoria suddenly stopped beside one of the grand staircases where dozens of guests had gathered to admire the magnificent ballroom below. She looked down at the small wrinkle near the hem of her own expensive gown and frowned. "Look what you have done," she announced, though Evelyn had not touched the fabric. Evelyn blinked in confusion. "I am sorry, but I did not—" "Do not argue with me," Victoria interrupted sharply. "If you had been paying attention instead of staring around the palace, this would never have happened." Her friends exchanged amused smiles. Margaret folded her arms without offering a word of fairness. Evelyn immediately knelt to smooth the edge of Victoria's gown, hoping to end the misunderstanding before it grew worse. The polished marble floor felt cold beneath her knees while dozens of elegant shoes surrounded her. A few guests slowed their pace to watch, curiosity quietly replacing conversation. Evelyn carefully finished straightening the fabric and rose with calm dignity, believing the awkward moment had finally passed. She did not see the silent glance Victoria exchanged with one of her companions, nor the faint smile that followed. Somewhere above the crowded ballroom, hidden behind the carved stone balcony overlooking the entire celebration, a tall figure had been observing every moment in complete silence. His silver eyes never once leaving the quiet Omega, who continued choosing grace, even when no one else chose it for her. From the highest balcony overlooking the Grand Hall, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stood without a single guard at his side, hidden behind carved stone arches that allowed him to observe every guest while remaining unseen himself. Few people understood why he preferred watching before announcing his arrival. His advisors believed he studied political alliances. His generals assumed he searched for hidden threats. Only Adrian knew the truth. A kingdom revealed its character long before it bowed to its king. He had ruled the northern territories for 12 years, long enough to recognize that true loyalty was never displayed during ceremonies. It appeared in ordinary moments when no reward was expected and no punishment seemed possible. His silver eyes slowly moved across the magnificent hall below, taking in every conversation, every smile, every calculated gesture. Wealth was easy to display. Kindness was far more difficult to fake. Earlier that afternoon, he had watched an elderly palace servant nearly lose control of a heavy tray before a young Omega quietly stepped forward to help without seeking recognition. She had accepted the servant's gratitude with nothing more than a warm smile before disappearing back into the crowd. No dramatic gesture, no audience, no expectation of praise. Adrian remembered details most people overlooked, and that brief exchange had remained in his thoughts far longer than the endless parade of rehearsed introductions filling the ballroom. His trusted advisor, Theodore Ashcroft, approached quietly from the corridor behind him. "Your Majesty, the council is prepared whenever you wish to make your entrance." Adrian did not turn away from the balcony. "Not yet." Theodore followed his gaze toward the gathering below. "You are watching someone." Adrian remained silent for several seconds before answering. "I am watching everyone." Theodore knew better than to challenge the king directly, yet curiosity remained written across his face. Adrian finally spoke again. "Titles reveal status, choices reveal character." Theodore nodded thoughtfully before allowing the silence to return. Below them, the elegant celebration continued without interruption. Musicians performed graceful melodies while noble families laughed beneath glittering chandeliers. Servants crossed the polished marble floor with perfect discipline. Every guest appeared determined to present the finest version of themselves beneath the royal banners. Yet Adrian noticed the invisible lines separating those who possessed influence from those expected only to serve. His attention settled once more upon the quiet Omega standing several steps behind the Carter family. She carried herself with remarkable composure, despite receiving neither affection nor respect from the people surrounding her. When another servant accidentally dropped a folded linen napkin nearby, she bent to retrieve it before anyone else reacted, returning it with the same gentle smile she had offered earlier. Once again, she expected nothing in return. Theodore quietly observed the king studying the young woman. "Should I ask the chamberlain who she is?" Adrian answered immediately. "No." "Then why continue watching her?" Theodore asked softly. Adrian's expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "Because everyone else is too busy watching themselves." At that very moment, Victoria Carter exchanged another subtle glance with one of her companions before adjusting the jeweled bracelet around her wrist. Her smile appeared flawless to every nearby guest, but Adrian noticed the calculation behind it. He had seen similar expressions countless times among ambitious nobles. They often appeared seconds before someone's dignity became the price of another person's entertainment. The orchestra began a brighter melody as palace attendants opened the towering doors leading toward the central ballroom, inviting every guest closer to the heart of the evening's celebration. Unaware that the eyes of the Alpha King had never left her for more than a few moments, Evelyn quietly followed her family into the growing crowd, stepping unknowingly toward the moment that would expose not only her own character, but the hearts of everyone standing around her. The center of the grand hall shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights as palace attendants invited every guest to gather around the great marble staircase where the evening ceremonies would soon begin. Conversations blended into a warm hum of anticipation, while musicians filled the air with graceful strings. Evelyn followed several steps behind Margaret and Victoria, keeping her eyes lowered as instructed, carrying the embroidered bag with steady hands. She reminded herself that the night would eventually end, and when it did, she could return home knowing she had remained true to herself. That quiet promise was enough to keep her breathing evenly, despite the constant reminders that she did not belong. Victoria slowed her pace near a circle of influential noble families, waiting until enough people had gathered before turning toward Evelyn with a polished smile that seemed almost friendly. "Would you bring me a glass of sparkling cider?" she asked sweetly. Evelyn nodded immediately and crossed toward a nearby refreshment table. The palace servers welcomed her with grateful smiles, remembering the kindness she had shown earlier. One of them handed her a crystal glass already filled with sparkling cider, thanking her again for helping an elderly colleague. Evelyn smiled warmly before carefully making her way back through the crowd, protecting every drop from spilling. From the balcony above, Adrian noticed the exchange without saying a word. His expression remained calm, but his attention sharpened. Theodore quietly waited beside him, sensing that the king had chosen not to interrupt whatever was unfolding below. As Evelyn approached, Victoria shifted slightly, just enough that the edge of her jeweled sleeve brushed against the delicate crystal glass. The movement was subtle, almost impossible to notice. The cider splashed across the front of Evelyn's handmade dress, darkening the carefully stitched fabric she had spent months creating. A quiet gasp spread through the nearest guests. Evelyn froze. Tiny droplets slid down the embroidered moonflowers her mother had inspired, each stain feeling heavier than the last. Before she could even apologize, Victoria sighed dramatically. "You truly cannot manage even the simplest task," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Margaret shook her head with visible disappointment. "I warned you to be careful. Must you embarrass this family wherever you go?" Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others whispered behind polite smiles, unwilling to become involved. Evelyn lowered her eyes, gently setting the half-empty glass upon a nearby table before quietly reaching into the embroidered bag for a folded handkerchief. She dabbed at the damp fabric without complaint, knowing the stains would likely remain. The silence around her became far more painful than the whispered comments. Not one voice stepped forward to say the accident had not been entirely her fault. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the carved stone railing. He had witnessed every movement, every expression, every deliberate choice. Yet he remained exactly where he was. His silence was not uncertainty, it was patience. A king who judged too quickly learned very little. A king who watched until every heart revealed itself learned everything. For several long moments, nothing changed. The music continued, crystal glasses reflected the warm light of the chandeliers. Noble families resumed their conversations, convincing themselves that silence was easier than honesty. Evelyn carefully continued dabbing the stained fabric with her handkerchief, refusing to let tears reach her eyes. She knew the dress could never look the way it had that morning, yet she stood with quiet dignity, offering no complaint and placing blame on no one. Victoria watched with quiet satisfaction before taking a slow step closer. "Perhaps," she said with a smile that sounded almost sympathetic, "you should return to the servants' entrance. You will only attract more attention if you remain here." A few nearby guests laughed softly, not because the remark was especially clever, but because it seemed safer to laugh than to disagree. Margaret gave a small, approving nod. "It would be best for everyone." Evelyn lowered her head and answered with the same calm voice she had used all evening. "If that is what you wish, I will leave." She turned carefully, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed the embarrassment lingering around her. Then another noblewoman standing beside Victoria reached toward the damp edge of Evelyn's sleeve with an amused smile. "You missed another stain," she said lightly. Instead of brushing away the remaining drops, her careless tug caught the delicate fabric that Evelyn had stitched by hand through countless late nights. A sharp tearing sound echoed through the suddenly quiet space. The embroidered seam along the sleeve separated, leaving the beautiful moonflower pattern uneven and broken. The sound itself was not loud, yet it seemed to silence the entire corner of the ballroom. Evelyn instinctively held the torn fabric together with trembling fingers. Months of patient work had disappeared in a single careless moment. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, trying to preserve what little remained of the dress her mother had inspired. Another ripple of laughter spread through parts of the crowd, mixed with awkward whispers from guests pretending not to stare. Some looked uncomfortable but remained where they stood. Others quietly turned away. Adrian watched every face from above. He no longer studied Evelyn alone. He studied the people surrounding her. He noted who laughed. He noted who stayed silent. He noted the servants whose expressions filled with concern, but who feared speaking without permission. Theodore glanced toward the king. "Your Majesty." Adrian did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained fixed upon the gathering below, calm but unwavering. "Now they have shown me who they are," he said quietly. Without another word, he stepped away from the balcony railing. His dark, ceremonial cloak flowed behind him as he crossed the private corridor leading toward the grand staircase. Palace guards standing at attention immediately straightened, sensing the change without needing an order. Below, Evelyn still held the torn sleeve together, unaware that the entire atmosphere of the palace had begun to shift. The musicians slowly lowered their instruments as the great bronze doors behind the marble staircase opened with deliberate precision. Conversations faded one by one until the hall rested beneath a silence so complete that every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Then, measured footsteps echoed across the polished stone floor, announcing that the Alpha King had finally chosen to enter the hall. Every conversation stopped before the Alpha King reached the center of the grand hall. Noble families bowed with perfect discipline, musicians lowered their instruments, and even the palace servants stood motionless beneath the towering chandeliers. Adrian Blackwood walked with calm, measured steps that carried neither haste nor hesitation. His dark ceremonial cloak swept softly across the polished marble, while the silver crest of the royal wolf caught the glow of the crystal lights. He acknowledged no one as he passed, His attention rested on a single figure standing quietly with one hand holding together the torn sleeve of a simple handmade dress. Evelyn lowered her head immediately, believing the king had arrived for the official ceremony rather than the uncomfortable scene surrounding her. She stepped backward, hoping to disappear into the crowd before drawing unwanted attention from the ruler of the Northern Territories. Instead, Adrian stopped only a few feet away. The silence became almost unbearable. Margaret forced a graceful smile and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, what an honor to welcome you." Victoria followed with a flawless curtsy, confidence returning to her face as though nothing unusual had happened. Adrian did not answer either of them. His gaze remained fixed on Evelyn. Without speaking, he removed the heavy royal cloak from his shoulders. Soft murmurs rippled through the gathering. No one could remember the last time the Alpha King had removed his ceremonial cloak in public. Evelyn looked up in quiet confusion just as Adrian stepped forward and gently placed the cloak around her shoulders, carefully covering the torn sleeve without a trace of hesitation. The rich fabric settled across her trembling hands, warm and impossibly soft. She instinctively looked at him with wide blue eyes, unable to understand why the most powerful man in the kingdom had chosen to shield her instead of ignoring her. Adrian finally turned toward the surrounding guests. His calm expression had not changed. Yet every word that followed carried the unmistakable authority of a king whose judgment would not be questioned. Who believed this was acceptable? No one answered. Several guests lowered their eyes, others shifted uneasily, suddenly fascinated by the marble floor beneath their feet. Victoria attempted a careful smile. "Your Majesty, it was only an unfortunate misunderstanding." Adrian looked directly at her, his voice remaining steady. "I watched every moment." The color slowly disappeared from Victoria's face. Margaret opened her mouth as though searching for an explanation, but none came. Adrian allowed another long silence to settle over the hall before speaking again. "Kindness requires courage when the crowd chooses comfort." His silver eyes moved across every noble standing nearby. "Many of you witnessed humiliation. Few of you witnessed your own silence." The words settled over the ballroom with greater weight than any shouted command could have carried. Evelyn tightened the royal cloak around herself, still struggling to believe any of this was real. For the first time that evening, she no longer felt invisible. Adrian glanced back at her with quiet reassurance before facing the gathering once more. His next words were spoken neither loudly nor angrily, yet they reached every corner of the grand hall. "If anyone believes that showing contempt for this young woman earns respect, let this be remembered instead. From this moment forward, anyone who chooses to dishonor her chooses to answer to the crown. That choice will never bring honor." Silence answered him, but this time it was no longer the silence of indifference. It was the silence of an entire kingdom realizing that everything they thought they understood had just changed. Evelyn could scarcely feel the polished marble beneath her feet. The royal cloak resting across her shoulders seemed impossibly warm, wrapping her in a sense of safety she had never experienced before. She looked down at the torn sleeve still visible beneath the heavy fabric, then slowly lifted her eyes toward Adrian. There was no pity in his expression, no trace of obligation, only a quiet certainty that unsettled everyone who had witnessed the scene. Around them, the grand hall remained completely silent. The same guests who had laughed only moments earlier now avoided meeting one another's eyes. Margaret finally gathered enough courage to step forward. She lowered herself into a respectful bow, forcing a composed smile that failed to hide the nervous tremble in her voice. "Your Majesty, if mistakes were made, I assure you they were never intended to offend the crown." Adrian regarded her with calm restraint. The crown was never the one being tested. His answer settled over the room like the final note of a solemn song. Margaret had no reply. Victoria swallowed hard, the confidence that had carried her throughout the evening fading beneath the weight of the king's unwavering gaze. Theodore Ashcroft stepped forward at Adrian's quiet signal. his voice carried clearly across the hall. By order of His Majesty, tonight's ceremony will pause while palace officials review the conduct that has taken place within these walls. Every guest is expected to remain with dignity and honesty. No accusation was shouted. No dramatic punishment followed. Instead, palace attendants respectfully escorted several witnesses aside so that each account could be heard fairly. The decision surprised many of the nobles. Adrian had not acted from anger. He had chosen truth over assumption, allowing character to reveal itself through honest testimony. One by one, servants described what they had seen. Several guests admitted they had watched in silence because they feared challenging influential families. Even the elderly servant Evelyn had helped earlier stepped forward with quiet courage, explaining how the young Omega had shown kindness without expecting recognition. Each voice added another piece to the story until the full picture stood before the hall with undeniable clarity. Evelyn listened in stunned silence. She had never imagined that anyone had truly noticed the small acts she considered ordinary. Adrian turned toward her once more. "You believed no one saw you," he said gently. "You were mistaken." She struggled to find words. "Your Majesty, I only tried to help where I could." Adrian gave the slightest nod. "Exactly." Those single words carried more honor than any title she had ever dreamed of receiving. The atmosphere throughout the ballroom transformed almost instantly. Guests who had ignored Evelyn earlier now looked at her with genuine respect. Several servants smiled quietly as they passed, relieved that compassion had finally been acknowledged instead of overlooked. Even those who had remained silent understood they had witnessed something greater than a royal intervention. They had watched a king measure worth not by wealth, family name, or appearance, but by everyday choices made when no one seemed to be watching. Above the towering windows, the first rays of the full moon began to shine across the palace, bathing the silver banners in a soft glow. Adrian briefly lifted his eyes toward the moonlit sky before looking back at Evelyn, as though recognizing a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud. Somewhere deep within the quiet stillness of the evening, destiny had already begun moving toward them, one gentle step at a time. The grand hall remained quiet long after the final witness had spoken. It was no longer the uneasy silence of people avoiding the truth. It was the thoughtful silence that followed when truth had finally been revealed. Moonlight poured through the towering palace windows, washing the marble floor with a gentle silver glow that softened every sharp shadow. Evelyn stood wrapped in the Alpha King's cloak, still struggling to understand how a single evening had transformed everything she believed about her place in the world. Only hours earlier, she had entered the palace, hoping to remain unnoticed. Now every eye in the kingdom seemed fixed upon her, not with ridicule, but with respect. Adrian stepped beside her, leaving enough space for her to feel comfortable while making it unmistakably clear that she stood under his protection. He looked across the gathered nobles before speaking one final time. "A kingdom is not measured by the strength of its walls or the wealth of its houses. It is measured by the way it treats the person with the least power to defend themselves." No one challenged his words. Many lowered their heads, recognizing themselves in the lesson without needing to be named. Margaret quietly stepped forward, her proud posture replaced by genuine humility. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I failed to show fairness in my own family." Adrian acknowledged her with a calm nod. "Then let fairness begin today." Victoria remained silent, her confident smile long gone. For the first time in years, she looked toward Evelyn not as someone beneath her, but as someone whose quiet strength she had never understood. Evelyn met her eyes without anger. She carried no desire for revenge, only a hope that the pain of the evening would not be repeated for anyone else. Adrian noticed the compassion in her expression and smiled almost imperceptibly. It confirmed everything he had observed throughout the day. Kindness had remained her first instinct. Even after humiliation, Theodore approached with a neatly folded bundle of fresh fabric prepared by the palace attendants. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully. The royal seamstresses would be honored to restore the young lady's dress before she departs. Evelyn looked down at the torn sleeve before gently touching the royal cloak resting around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. Adrian answered with reassuring warmth. Some things can be repaired with thread. Others are restored by reminding people of their worth. As the orchestra resumed its graceful melody, palace servants opened the great balcony doors overlooking the moonlit gardens. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of moonflowers through the hall. At that very moment, a faint silver shimmer reflected across Evelyn's necklace, catching Adrian's attention for only an instant before fading beneath the light of the full moon. Neither of them spoke of it, yet both felt an unexplainable sense of familiarity, as though destiny had quietly introduced itself without revealing its full story. The guests slowly returned to the celebration, but nothing felt the same as before. They no longer remembered only the elegance of the festival. They remembered the quiet Omega whose dignity never broke, the king who judged character instead of status, and the simple truth that changed an entire room. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. Sometimes it appeared in the moment one person chose compassion while everyone else chose silence. And beneath the silver light of the full moon, the first chapter of a far greater story had only just begun.